So good afternoon. My name is Saida Ramzan Asker. I am a senior employment lawyer in Government Legal Department. I'm also the co-chair of the Government Legal Department's Disability and Wellbeing Network, as well as being the co-chair for the REACH Senior Disability Network. I am today joined virtually by Ben Merrick, who's a director at Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Deputy Disability Champion for the Civil Service. This video is one of a series of 6 workshops on empowering disabled people into senior grades. This video will be shared with Cross Civil Service Senior Disability Network, as well as across civil service widely, to benefit disabled people wanting to progress and develop their careers into more senior grades. I will be shortly asking Ben various questions about his career journey and development, and also about disability generally. So firstly, thank you so much, Ben, for joining us this afternoon.
You're welcome.
My first question is, can you tell us briefly about your current job and how your career has brought you to this point?
Yes, thank you. I am the Director for the Overseas Territories in the Foreign Office, and as part of that I'm also the Commissioner, which is the same as the Head of Government, for the British Indian Ocean Territory and the British Antarctic Territory. So I deal with a lot of different issues overseas and in the UK, and with lots of different parts of the UK government. And in addition to that, as you say, I have a corporate role. I'm the Deputy Disability Champion for the Civil Service, and I'm also the Disability Champion for the UK National Security Community. I suppose I came at this in a somewhat circuitous way. I've been in the civil service all my career, mostly in defence, although I had a secondment to what is now the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I was working on social exclusion. I also did a short 3-month project on a classified subject in the Cabinet Office. So I've done a variety of things. I did a Master's in my spare time, an MSc in Diplomacy and International Strategy, whilst I was at the MOD. And part of that was with an eye to potentially go on to the Foreign Office, which I then did. I came in as the Deputy Director, and the Director role came up, and I went for that. And part of that was because I had put myself forward for the Senior Leaders Scheme, which was a development scheme to get people from a Deputy Director to Director level. And so I decided to build on everything I'd learned from that scheme and got to where I am now.
Yes, thank you. And how would you describe yourself?
That's always a difficult question. I think I am someone who is very much motivated by public service. So for me, the values of the civil service are extremely important, and I'm very keen always to make a difference. I think for me also, it's very much a long-term career approach, which is why I'm therefore keen both to make sure that everyone else who works on these issues is as fulfilled and motivated as possible, but particularly also that everyone gets the opportunity to learn and develop. I've been a bit of a learning and development junkie for much of my life. I think it's really important to constantly be learning new things and creating new skills and so on. Both because that's a good thing in itself, but it makes us do our jobs much better. So I'm always particularly passionate about those things, outcomes and so on. But I do also think that wherever possible, we should seek to get the benefits and the opportunities going, and therefore that we should enjoy ourselves as much as possible. And so, as well as being interested and inquisitive, I do try to be fairly relaxed and laid back and approachable with everyone I engage with.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. You mentioned at the outset that you are the disability champion in the department you work, and you also you champion the rights for disabled people across civil service. What motivates you to do this?
I think a number of things. Just a clarification, I'm not the disability champion yet. We have some very good champions there, but certainly I do that role for the civil service as a whole and for the national security community. And for me, I think championing is really important because it links to a number of things. I suppose I initially got into this in the context of role modelling. When I was coming up through the civil service, there was never anyone above me that I could point to and say, well, they've done it, so I can as well. And often, if you haven't seen that it is possible to do things, then certain things just seem to be either very difficult or completely impossible. And I suppose I often created some sort of self-limitations, if you will, just assuming that things weren't possible. And then either I would finally try a bit, or my wife or my friends would sort of nudge me into it, and then I'd find that actually certain things were doable. So I think that role modelling aspect is really important, but also the championing side is especially important, because there are a series of people with different challenges, particularly the underrepresented groups, who clearly need more help. And even at my level, I need others' assistance with certain things for getting through. Bearing in mind we're 25 years after the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995, if these things were easy, someone would have sorted it all out by now. So I think the championing role is very important, and that's partly a conscience role and advocacy, but some of this is also about actually making sure that the levers are in place and being pulled properly so that things really happen. So I think it's very important that champions have both sort of some resource to call on and also the ability to get involved in the sort of higher levels of decision making. So linking champions to boards and so on is particularly important. I'm fortunate that in my Deputy Disability Champion role for the Civil Service, I have several excellent colleagues working in the disability team in the Cabinet Office who assist me with that. But I do think, as I say, a lot of this public advocacy is a key part of what championing is about for me.
I mean, I think the point that you made about they have, that you're not being able to see people that have done it, and that motivating somebody with a disability to say, I can do it too, it's a real issue. And I think it's more pronounced as you go higher and higher up the senior civil service. And I think that's probably also equally true with the private sector as well. Over the time that you've been with the civil service, do you think that has improved? Has that got better? I mean, I recognise that not all disabilities are visible, so you won't always know if somebody has a disability or not. But generally speaking, do you feel confident? Do you feel that things are getting better? I mean, certainly
I think it's getting better, and I think there have been a number of very positive moves. So, for example, in relation to mental health, it was very good to see the various videos that a number of our senior colleagues made. And Rupert, for example, Rupert McNeill did a very good recording in that context, as have a number of other senior civil servants. So I think that has very much improved. I think the conversation is definitely coming on, and the understanding of the business rationale for inclusion is much better than it was in the past. Even then, we still need to keep pushing, because people often think it's about the moral and the legal case, which is, important. But the key thing, I think, is that we get much better policy and delivery outcomes when we have a properly inclusive approach to things. We get much better recruitment and retention, and we're much more representative of society. So I think those aspects are particularly important. And we do need to make sure we keep pushing. But I can't say that there are people above me with vision impairments in the civil service that I can just copy or emulate. But I do get much more sense, and a lot of people do get in contact with me to say that the sorts of work that I and colleagues like me are doing is helpful to them, because it gives them much more sort of sense of momentum and possibility and so on. So yes, I do think the civil service is certainly moving in the right direction.
Fantastic, thank you. So just moving on slightly to your journey with a disability. When you meet new people who may not know about your condition, how it affects you, how do you raise the subject? Are you very upfront, or do you wait until it comes up naturally?
I'm very upfront. In terms of Myers-Briggs and all that, I'm definitely at the fairly extrovert end. But a long time ago, I felt this sort of irrational shame or sort of embarrassment, not really wanting to tell people about these things. And so I quite often at social events ask a series of open questions, which would hopefully help me to guess who the person was. So they come up to say, "Oh, hi Ben, how's it going?" And I'd have to say, "Oh, how is your job? And how's the family?" And hope that they would then give me the pointers that would enable me to work out who they were without letting on. And this went spectacularly wrong one time when I went to someone's birthday party, and I spent a long time trying to work out who this person was. This was the birthday of an old family friend. And finally I said, "Oh, remind me how you know Harriet again?" And the person said, I'm her sister. And it was at this point, it was completely obvious that I'd obviously been lying for the last 20 minutes. And I just thought, actually, you just need to get over yourself. And so now I just tell the people I'm engaging with, not in a hopefully a sort of over-emphasised fashion, but I just say, if someone comes up and says, "Hi Ben," I just say, "Nice to see you. I'm visually impaired, so can you just remind me who you are?" And it's fine. And actually, most of the time, because people know my situation, they'll just say, "Hi, it's John," or whatever. And so I think it's much better doing that. Now, occasionally, if I'm in some big reception, and I'll meet someone who I can be very sure that I will never meet again, I might not bother. But everyone else, I usually mention it to them. And it's just a lot easier. If I'm in a situation when I might not recognise someone later on in the evening, or I might need a bit of assistance with something which otherwise they would think was very straightforward, it's just a lot easier to tell people. And so, yes, I always do that. And after a while, it's not a problem for me, but also, hopefully, it's very empowering to others. I found one of my senior colleagues, now retired, had never particularly told people about his dyslexia. And he'd done lots of senior roles, but never really wanted to tell people. But it was when I was just there being very open about it that he realised that this would be okay to do. So he started telling people, and it was just no big deal. But because he did that, a much more junior person in his team also then sort of came out, so to speak, as dyslexic in that case. And it just normalised the whole thing. It made that junior person feel much more comfortable about doing it rather than having to draw lots of attention from himself. So I do think it's very important that people are upfront about these things and about their needs. As ever, it's always a bit relative. Sometimes it just doesn't particularly matter. But certainly, if I'm telling people in the context where, for example, I may not recognise them or I might not be able to see signs on the wall, then I'll just tell people straight up and just make sure it's not a big deal.
Yeah, and I think the key point in that also is that there's no one size fits all, because some people don't always want to be defined by their disability, particularly not at work. That's where they want to be identified just as a worker or somebody who's produced this brilliant piece of work, always very good at this, and don't want to be defined by their disability. Others may want to. And I think that's really important that people recognise, especially people that are managing people with disabilities, that just because one person reacts and behaves in a certain way with their disability does not necessarily follow that the next person. You have to adjust your approach.
Yes, that's exactly right. And you're exactly right to mention managers. So a lot of the work that we do is about supporting line managers of disabled people. And clearly you want the disabled person very much to feel ownership of what they're doing or how things are communicated. And as you say, it's very important that people feel comfortable like that, because not everyone would want to operate as I do, and vice versa. So I think that is fundamental. But I certainly find personally that being able to tell people about this just means that they then also know how best they can work with me and so on. As well as telling people when we first meet, what I do if I join a new directorate, for example, is that I've actually got a page or so, and I actually send that round to everyone in advance, and that is in my directorate induction kit, just about how best to work with me as well. So I do think that's helpful, and that just again makes it straightforward for people. But as you say, different things work for different people.
Yeah, no, and I think you're absolutely right that these conversations are important, because it does normalise it, and it gives a message that it's okay. Particularly where managers feel that they should know everything about disability, and they should know how it is that they're supposed to work with you and how they're supposed to make the adjustments. And it almost sends out a message that it's okay to ask questions if you're not sure about anything. And let's have a healthy, constructive discussion about it, because I think sometimes...
And that's exactly right. And of course, we often think that disability is somehow special, but I often draw the comparison with people who have caring responsibilities, or who may be working from home on Wednesdays and Fridays, or whatever it might be, to look after the kids. Now, obviously, in this days of COVID, that has changed quite a lot. But certainly back in the days when we were working in the office most of the time, if we had someone who was always at home on a Friday or whatever, we would then just organise all the team meetings on other days when everyone was around. So, there are often these sort of situations when we just need to manage a bit differently. Equally, I work with a lot of people who are in different time zones, so we clearly manage meetings so that everyone can join at the correct times of the day. A lot of it is just about thinking about the different particular needs of our various colleagues and adapting as necessary to fit with those.
Yep, brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. So with regards to disability, a lot of people with disabilities often feel that they are at a disadvantage. They're facing problems that need to be overcome. Is that how you see yourself, or do you see yourself as being more skilled or advantaged because of the nature of your condition and the coping strategies you may have developed over time? If it's the latter, what's your superpower?
Undoubtedly, disability creates some issues. So, the three particular ones in my case are that I can't read things unless they're hugely magnified, and even not very quickly, or recognise people, not their faces, or indeed drive. So, that does create some issue. However, as I put in my blog, one of my blogs, which is on the gov.uk site, there are often a set of other issues which come along, unexpected advantages. So in my case, there are several. One is that I have to do a lot of public speaking in my role, and because I can't use notes anyway, I'm much more able to speak either off the cuff or publicly, thinking about a structure, the key messages I need to do, and that can actually make one a lot more confident. Now, initially, that has some challenges, but in terms of being more engaging, that is very helpful. It makes me more strategic because I can't focus on the detail, and I have to sit back and say, what are the big issues here? How do I deliver through my team and get them to do the detail while I sit back a bit? So that is very helpful. It makes me better organised because I have to be. It makes me more empathetic, I think, because I have been through a lot and come out the other side. And that's often the case with disabled people. So they're often a lot more resilient and empathetic than people who haven't had these sorts of issues to deal with. So I think, that just happens to be my personal situation, but often there are a number of unexpected advantages that creates. And, that goes for all sorts of different issues or adversities or other aspects that one has to deal with in life that frequently we seek to take the benefits that there may be from these things. Even if you take something like COVID, which is clearly a problem, there are benefits in terms of the fact that those who work from home more are now very much on a level with everyone else who is also now working from home, and the technology is much improved, etc. So with disability and other things, often there are advantages that one wouldn't expect. Now, that's not sort of to depict everyone with a disability as suddenly superhuman. Inevitably there will remain challenges, but I do think there are a number of aspects where there are definitely positives to think about and to build on.
Brilliant, thank you so much for sharing that. Before I ask you some career advice for our members, I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions, if that's okay. My first question is, best piece of advice you have received?
This was from a HR manager in, I think it was one of the big four accountancy firms when I went there on my senior leader scheme. And she said to focus on opportunities rather than specific jobs. So actually, I've always sought to just make myself generally available for all sorts of opportunities as they come along, and then just see where that takes me, rather than saying I want that job and then that job and then that job. So I think, yes, just being open to all sorts of opportunities and experiences is really important.
Thank you. Next question, iPhone or Android?
iPhone. I have to say, I was a bit of a technophobe, and this is one of the things that I slightly annoyed about, because I just assumed that using smartphones would be pretty difficult with my visual impairments, and I did use another sort of setup for a bit. But I then got on to iPhone, and I love it. But I also have an iPad and an iPod, so I think Apple is doing quite well at it.
Yeah, I'm a firm supporter of an iPhone, so that's a good answer. What's your favourite movie?
It's probably The Godfather Part 2, although we did just watch Hamilton this weekend, which is a sort of movie, obviously a movie of a play, of musical, I should say, and that was extremely good as well. So. But lots of movies I do like.
Brilliant. And if you could describe yourself as a teenager in 3 words.
Let's see. Well, I'm not sure how many words this is quite good. I was slightly badly behaved. 3 words. But I was definitely inquisitive. So I think I've exceeded my word limit there.
I think my teenager would use the word inquisitive, but I'm not sure that's the word I would describe. So, best gift you have ever received?
Ooh, well, my uncle always gave very good gifts. He gave me a clock radio. When was that? In 1995, I think it was, and it's still going. So it's probably that in terms of longevity.
Brilliant. And do you have any pets?
No, I have 2 small children, so 4 pets and so on. So we used to have cats when I was small. My wife had dogs, and so we still haven't quite managed to work out which pet we would have at the moment because we tend to be rather too busy. But yes, I think there's a plan to get a dog at some point, or someone else's plan to get a dog.
Yeah, my children have got a plan to get a cat, but I'm not alive to this plan. I don't share this plan with them. I feel we've got our hands full. Could you name a book that you've read that positively shaped you?
Yeah, there are all sorts actually. I got sort of definitely into the more non-fiction end of things recently. There's a very good book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Robert Rumor, which I can strongly recommend, which we covered on my course. And that was really good actually in terms of thinking strategically. I think I had a number of other books which all sound a bit sort of geeky, but are quite good. So there's a book called Why We Sleep. And actually I've definitely got much more into the art of sleeping, which might sound a bit odd, but it has such a big impact on health and so on. And then there's, I can't remember the exact title, but I think it's Slow Thinking, Fast Thinking, I can't remember the exact name, about how the brain operates. And that definitely had quite an impact on me as well. So there's all sorts of other books which are fiction, which definitely had an impact. But those ones I did find very useful.
Brilliant, thank you. If you could have 3 people over for dinner, who would they be?
Let's see. We have Nelson Mandela for one. He would be particularly interesting. I think Charles Dickens as well. I mean, as well as the work. I think the sort of social campaigning I found very interesting as well. And then perhaps the Queen as well, just in terms of being able to do some name dropping, and the number of people she's met, I think, would be quite interesting in terms of her anecdote value, assuming she was prepared to open up on that subject.
Brilliant. Main course or dessert?
I'd probably say main course, although my wife is an extremely good cook and indeed baker, so she's definitely got me much more into desserts. I think key lime pie is one of my favourites. So nice. I'll probably, sort of be a bit ambivalent on this answer.
Okay, so that's it on the rapid fire questions. So I'm now going to move on to some career questions. My first question is, can you share with our members how you go about applying for a job, any hints, tips for either the written application or the interview?
Yes. So, I mean, it's a bit like looking for a house as well, in that, actually spending quite a lot of time thinking about what motivates me is really important. So rather than just sort of flicking through the job ads and going, that'll do, actually spending quite a lot of time saying, okay, where am I at? What sort of things do I like and find interesting? I mean, I'm sort of very clear on the kind of values that I have. So the civil service very much fits in with that. But, is it about national security, for example, or is it about leadership or project management, or all those sorts of things? So enabling you to have a sense of the sorts of jobs that one finds interesting, because that's then a useful way of testing whether the specific jobs you then see are right for that. Making sure that you've got access to as many of the sort of job ad areas as possible, but also if I was particularly interested in Department X, then getting in touch with their HR people to say, I'm interested, please let me know if particular opportunities come along, and making sure I've done that, because often it'll be on the CS job site, but not automatically, so making sure that one's done that. And then I think I really prepare for job interviews, particularly in terms of researching the subject, because apart from anything else, if I'm going to do something for 3 or 4 years, I would want to know that I find that interesting and there's scope for real delivery and making a difference. So I'd spend a lot of time researching it and speaking to a lot of different people, both in the department in question, but also think tanks or people in other organisations who might have different perspectives that one wants to compare and contrast. I would spend a lot of time thinking about the sorts of questions which are likely to be asked, and whether it's in relation to the competencies or experiences or other sorts of things, and thinking about that is very important. And then really practicing those sorts of things and making sure that I am ready. But of course, one can take a step back, and I've found in the past that actually preparing several years in advance for an interview is helpful. Now, people often think they've misheard when I say that. But if I'm going to go for an interview when I know that someone is going to ask me about leadership, let's say, or delivering a big strategy, if I've got examples to answer those questions, great. But if I haven't, and I did this before, then actually seeking a strategy that I can formulate and help to deliver then is good in itself. It gives me very good evidence for that. So I quite often will seek new opportunities so that I have that sort of evidence. And then there's also the stuff on the day, so making sure you're properly prepared, had a decent night's sleep and a good breakfast, and actually thinking carefully about the interview dynamics. So making sure you're answering the question, making sure that you are bringing out why you are a suitable person. I think also with all answers, it's very good to be able to demonstrate what you've learnt from the experience and how you've developed as a result of that, because any senior roles we're going to go into will involve a lot of L&D and adapting to new circumstances and so on. So yes, I think there's all sorts of angles, but it's particularly important to have a good sense of what you find interesting in the role and what the big issues are and how you can really make a difference.
Brilliant, thank you. Those are really good insights. Can you share with our members your top 3 career tips, either generally or specific to somebody with a disability?
Yes, so I suppose several tips. I mean, one is this broader point about seeking to get as much learning and development as possible, of all sorts, but particularly leadership. But I've done a number of things. So I mentioned the Senior Leader Scheme. I did a diploma in financial management in my spare time a while ago. I did an MSc in diplomacy and international strategy in my spare time. I've done lots of other courses on project and program management, all those sorts of things. So spending lots of time developing skills and knowledge and experience is always useful. I think having a sort of span of roles in different areas is certainly I found quite useful. So I've done a couple of secondments. And I've made sure that I've sought to learn from that, but also built up my networks as much as possible. Because the higher up you go, the more you find yourself bumping into people that you've worked with in different contexts and so on. I think particularly in the context of my disability, I spent a long time focusing on my self-awareness, and I think that's important, whoever you are, able-bodied or disabled, to really have a good understanding of what you're particularly good at, what you're less good at, but you can improve on, and what you're just less good at and inevitably you will find much more difficult to improve on. because then accentuating the positive and minimizing the negative is a much better way to then really make sure you're doing stuff that is best for you and where you can deliver best and so on. Now, as I said, in terms of my technophobe aspect, sometimes there's new stuff which I need to push myself into, and then I'll discover that I can do certain things better. And occasionally one has to do something that feels a bit uncomfortable to start with in order to get used to it. But I think inevitably giving yourself those new and different experiences is very important. You're probably familiar with the 2x2 grid of consciousness and competence. So the idea being in many things you can be unconsciously incompetent. And then the next stage is when you are consciously incompetent. And that's the most difficult bit. And everyone goes, oh, this is all very tricky. But then when you move across to conscious competence, and then finally to unconscious competence, that is the path that everyone moves through. I used to work in my spare time as a volunteer for Childline. So I was a counsellor there, I trained new counsellors and so on. And we often found that when we were training new people, that to start with is incredibly difficult when they realise what they're being expected to do, but after a while they found it easy. And so, as I say, career-wise, it's always good just expanding all the different things. And as I said before, just being open to the opportunities that come along.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. That's been really, really useful. In your own career, looking back, is there anything that you would have done differently with the benefit of hindsight?
Yes, I mean, there are always lots of things that I'd have done differently. I suppose, at the early stage in my career, the technology was nowhere near as good as it is today. So even just surviving on that was very difficult. And so I probably didn't sort of push myself as much as I might, but that just was because that's what the world of work felt like, and that was very difficult. The thing I suppose I was particularly struck by, there was a role I was doing, and suddenly I found myself in a bad place in terms of this just felt like the wrong job to be doing, and I'd been there for too long, and I didn't really want to be in that role or that organisation any longer. But it took me about 6 months to get out of that. Now, that was particularly because of my disability, because the nature of the assistive software can take a long time. So in terms of the next job I went into, that took a very long time to get out from where I was originally to the new one. And so the key thing I learned from that is always to have a broad awareness of the strategic context that I'm operating in. So thinking about whether I'm still learning new stuff and still enjoying what I'm doing, thinking about future opportunities there might be, or future things I might want to prepare myself for, and constantly having that sort of longer term sense, so that I don't then suddenly find myself in a position that I found before. Inevitably, there are always other issues one finds oneself in. There was a particular role where actually it wasn't especially taxing at all, although the subject matter was extremely interesting. So it's difficult to get these things exactly right. But I think the key thing is making sure that the roles you're doing fit with your values. And as long as that's the case, then there's always something good that you can get from most roles.
Thank you. So often people with certain characteristics, be it whether they're from a BAME background or with a disability, they often complain of having a imposter syndrome because of their disability, because of their background. What advice would you give to somebody who has a disability and is suffering from imposter syndrome?
Well, I think it's supposed to be something like 70% of people have imposter syndrome at some point. So I suppose first advice is that you are in the majority if you have imposter syndrome, and I've often felt like that as well. There's a useful, many years ago, I used to we did sort of target shooting and things, and there was a saying there we had, which is that if you always hit the target, you're standing in the place. And I think that's really important, because if you go into a job and after week one it's a doddle and you're finding it very easy, that is a really bad sign, because that kind of suggests that you're not being stretched, and after about a month you will get bored and plateau and potentially even actually dip. And as I say, I've certainly come across people who are just not remotely stretched, and in fact they are under stressed, if anything, which is a very bad situation to be in. So firstly, I think recognising that often there are challenges in new roles, and you would not expect everyone to be hitting the ground sprinting on day one. So that's the first point. I think the second point is thinking about the nature of confidence and self-awareness. That comes back to the self-awareness point of understanding both what you're good at, but also how you learn and how you improve. And I found that if I'm coming into something where it's pretty difficult, then actually saying, okay, well, it's not the first time I've dealt with something that's pretty difficult, so what will I do about it? And I was quite struck with the phrase that someone in HR once made, that she said, what we're looking for is people who know what to do when they don't know what to do. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about that phrase, because they're saying, okay, this thing seems very difficult. How do I get lots of sources of advice? So rather than feeling I have to struggle on my own, how do I engage with others to assist me with this sort of thing? I think it's also sort of from a confidence point of view saying, well, how did I get here in the first place? And when I did the senior leaders scheme, there was a good little exercise we did on that with RADA. And you have someone at the front who is the quotes imposter, but everyone is then behind them supporting them. So you have someone who represents their skills, someone who represents their experience, someone who represents their place in the hierarchy, etc., all supporting that person. And so I think when you say, actually, there are good reasons why I'm here, and all these different people, these different notions are supporting me, then I do think that is quite helpful. But it comes back to things like training and development, and there's lots of ways in which people can be helped through. And there's nothing like a good bit of preparation. So I think making sure that when one goes into a job, you actually thought about what the job may entail, but sort of spending as much time thinking things through as possible. And especially the higher up you go, and this is hopefully especially relevant for the Reach network, really trying to carve out time for strategic thinking. That's the big thing. What we tend to lack is time, and particularly time for sitting back and really thinking about the big issues in what we're doing. So I would always suggest that as a particular means of then trying to tackle some of these things like imposter syndrome.
Brilliant, thank you. There's some really good stuff coming out of there, and some good advice for people and our members in particular. What's been your biggest setback, and how have you come back from it? And how would you generally say that you deal with setbacks?
My biggest career setback, I assume.
Yeah.
No, I only asked because obviously losing my sight was something of a setback as well. Let's see. Well, it's interesting. I've had several times, when I've had to think about this, and I've dealt with a lot over my time, and whether it's my disability or whether it's a massive amount of work or high pressure, I wish there's been a lot, and I've sort of worked through it and fairly happily. The thing that is definitely my Achilles heel is if I think I've done something bad or something wrong, haven't done it as well as I could have, then often I beat myself up about it far too much. And no one else does. No one else beats me up about it, but I tend to. And so I've had a couple of times when something bad has happened, and it's not as though anyone else has seen the bad thing coming along, but I felt I should have done. And so I sort of beat myself up about that and lost quite a bit of sleep over some of these things. But then I found eventually over time that the key thing is to, apologise if need be, and just say, okay, fine. How do I learn from this? How do I solve the problem at the moment? And I can't always solve the problem, but how do I make the thing as right as I can do, and then learn from it and move on? And so that's what I do each time. Whenever these bad things happen, then I work through it like that. And also I have found from a self-awareness point of view that by being aware that that is what's going on and that is why I might be operating like that, it does then help me to get through that process more quickly as well. So those are probably the sorts of things that I'd set. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the particular sort of setback I had when I suddenly realised I was in a bad place, and the key thing again was learning about that and saying, okay, as well as solving it at the time, how do I then make sure that this isn't going to happen again? But yes, it all comes back down to self-awareness and learning.
Yeah, no, I think most of what you've said there really resonates with me because I mean, I don't like setbacks like most people, but I always feel that setbacks are an inevitable process of life as well. And it's what I can take away from that. If there is a learning, if there's something I could do differently going forward, then, you know, it's unfortunate to have that setback, but at least you've got something to take away and do differently. And it's very likely that when you come to do that thing again, you will do it very differently because you have taken on board those learning points. So that's, I think that those are really important points there.
And
So
I think a
thank you.
lot of it is about resilience as well, because of course the risk is if you're just focused on work and the task in question, there's a risk of being very sort of narrow-minded on some of these things. And so it's really important having other areas, whether it's social or family or interest or whatever it might be, that one can use to counterbalance some of those sorts of things. And even for something like COVID, which has inevitably been pretty tricky, you know, I've used that as the opportunity to take up running, as I imagine quite a few people have. And you know, at the beginning of the 9 weeks, if someone said run a minute, then that's probably about as much as I was prepared to do. But I went through the Couch to 5K thing, so I'm now running 40 minutes at a time, and then there's a park near us and so on. So I think having the opportunity to just do other stuff, particularly exercise, but whatever it might be, something that you enjoy and just takes your mind off things is always a good way to try and put setbacks in context.
Interesting. I about a month ago, I completed the Couch to 5K.
Ah,
I had a friend who was trying to get me to do it for many years, and I was convinced I couldn't do it.
mm,
And I think in the end, I just did it because I thought I would just get her off my back and tell
ah.
her, look, I can't do it. But yeah,
But I mean, I do think that's quite a good example because I remember years ago, it was probably, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, I did go for, I thought, oh, I'll go for a run. And it was terrible and horrible. And I came back with my knees aching and absolute agony. I'm never doing that again. But that, of course, was because, and it's back to the imposter thing, because I tried to do it all in one go. And I thought I tried to do a sort of half-hour run and given up after about 5 minutes. Whereas, as you know, the nature of Couch to 5K is you do a bit at a time and you just build up and build up until after a while, half an hour just, you know, not that big a deal. And so on. So I think that's sort of quite a good little analogy for a lot of these things we'll be talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us about one particular civil service initiative for disabled staff that has helped you to progress your career or you think would make an impact for others?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things. I mean, I've been on several schemes, as I mentioned. So there's one called Leaders Unlimited, which was aimed at people from underrepresented groups. There was the Senior Leader Scheme I mentioned. So I think there are a number of different ways in which one can do these things. Certainly, aspects of those have been particularly useful. So I do think things like peer learning sets, whatever one calls them, are very helpful, getting people together of a sort of similar level with similar issues to work that through. I think coaching is very helpful. I think also encouraging people to do things like learning logs and actually being very active about development are very good. And seeking to buddy people up or get them with mentors who may have had similar experiences, I think has also been good. I mean, I certainly found with some of the training that we had through the Senior Leader Scheme, it was interesting because we had a whole lot of it about leadership and communication, and I thought, oh, the communication stuff will be quite straightforward, but it was really helpful and important. We had this great stuff from RADA talking about how to communicate with impact. I always used to speak far too quickly and indistinctly. And so actually spending time saying, how am I coming across? How can I have greater impact? Is all useful for leadership and just communication in general. So I think a number of those things have been particularly helpful, but really, as I say, just the general focus on learning and adapting to one's particular skills and advantages and so on.
Yeah, so I mean, really good things coming out there, such as Leaders Unlimited, the Senior Leadership Scheme, peer learning sets, coaching, learning logs, and communicating with impact. I've recently discovered a learning log, and I think it's been really, really insightful for me, because from 1 month to the next month, you're doing so much that you will forget. And then when you look through it and you think, oh my God, and actually some days you feel, and this can be part and parcel of having a disability, you think, hasn't been a very productive day. But when you actually look through your learning log, it's actually quite insightful.
No, very much so. But also, I mean, I think doing these things actively and consciously is the best way to really improve. Otherwise, the risk is you learn something and then you just carry on and then you learn the same thing again. But unless you're actually applying it, then you're not really making the most of it. So yes, I think that's a definite advantage of a learning log. But again, it's not just something for recording. It's something which should actually then sort of drive and inform what you do as a result.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Who would you say is your biggest supporter, and who is your role model?
Well, it depends. I mean, my wife is incredibly supportive, and I'm extremely lucky that she has been as supportive as she had. Although, interestingly, it's often people you wouldn't normally expect. There was someone who was still, in fact, in the MOD, called Leslie, she was the person who put me on the senior leader scheme. I mean, I mentioned I went for it, but to be precise, I'd gone for a director job and hadn't got it. And so Leslie said, well, why don't you try for the senior leader scheme? And I thought she was just trying to sort of fob me off and, make me feel slightly better. And so, well, all right then. So I went for that, but it was really good. So I think, she has had a substantial impact on me. But yes, I mean, I have a number of sort of supporters, and certainly, my boss at the moment. It's not just because she's my boss, but she's extremely supportive as well. So I think a number of people like that. In terms of role models, difficult to say really. I think certainly, I think there are a number of people in the civil service who, at a senior level, I look at and say, well, actually, they've done a lot of different things that it would be, good to be able to emulate. I mean, generally, when you go on leadership schemes, they say, think of that perfect person, and how. And actually, normally for me, there are different sort of aspects of different roles and so on. I think certainly my friend Paul Lincoln, who is the head of the border force, and we joined the MOD at the same time. Paul's done extremely well, but he's always been incredibly committed and very sort of very, very sharp and very incisive, but I think he's very good at bringing people along with him. So I think he's done very well. But there are all sorts of people who one can look at and admire in different ways. And as I say, different people will have different things that one likes about how they've operated.
Certainly sound like good role models and great supporters. So finally, my final question, what is the most important thing that you want to leave with us today?
I think the most important thing, particularly for Reach, but anyone else, is that whole emphasis, which hopefully has come out rather a lot in my answers, on constant learning and evolution and adaptation and all those sorts of things, because sometimes we do the same job for quite a long time, but actually we should constantly be trying to shift and evolve and adapt, which is frankly useful for us anyway in terms of future jobs, but also just makes us perform much better and is more helpful to our colleagues as well. So I think that for me is the fundamental thing. And I think the other thing is really getting across the values of both the civil service and the organisations that we operate in, because I think it's values which really bind an organisation together, which really motivate people, and also, frankly, which attract people to come and join and work with us in the first place. So I think really having an emphasis on that, but it needs to be a conscious emphasis. When I did my senior leader scheme interview, they said, "How do you champion the values of the civil service?" So I blagged my way through the answer, but clearly I didn't have a very good answer. And off the back of that, I thought, well, I should have a much better answer to this question. And ever since then, which was 6 years ago or so, I've always been really upfront about the importance of values and actually making sure that we not only know them, but we live them and what we're doing. So that would be the other part.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you ever so much, Ben. That's been so insightful. It's been very inspiring. You shared some really important tips, some of which I'd just like to summarise because I thought they were really, really good. And the first one is, being open to opportunities. It's really important that you look at that and not just the actual job. The importance of, you mentioned this importance of self-awareness and ask yourself questions. What is it that motivates me? Where am I at this point in my time? What things interest me? Getting to know yourself and then sort of, targeting what jobs would be appropriate for yourself. You also mentioned something quite interesting, which I've not heard before, which is proactively contacting departments, preparing for applications and interviews several years in advance, which is really good. And also you mentioned trying to get as much learning and development, knowledge and experience as possible, whether that's to do courses or secondment opportunities or shadowing. All of that's really, really important. And again, focusing on the self-awareness, what is it I'm good at, and carry on doing that. What am I not as good as, and how could I improve that? I think those are really, really good conversations that any person who is wanting to progress their career should be having. And I think you should be having those conversations generally. I really liked your phrase where you used, if you hit the target, then you are too close.
If you always hit the target, you're standing too close.
Yeah,
you're allowed to hit the target occasionally.
Yeah.
But I say that to kids as well, because if they're reading books where they understand every word, then they're not really stretching themselves and learning new stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So that also resonated with me as well. So a lot of good tips, a lot of advice for our members who are, either progressing their careers currently or are thinking about developing themselves and progressing either from a 7 to 6 or 6 into SES. I think you've given them quite a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And actually, since you mentioned 7 to 6 and 6 up, the one final thought I'd leave people with is, we work in a hierarchy, inevitably, which is not a bad thing, it's just how it is. But I think it's really important that people understand and think about the nature of work at different levels. So when I was going from 6 to SCS, I actually spent a lot of time thinking about what it meant to operate at deputy director level and how that differentiated from the previous one. Equally, when I went from that to director level, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. I think that's important not just for interviews, but also so you're really operating at the correct strategic level rather than doing your old job but for several hours longer each day, if you see what I mean. So I think from a development scheme point of view, then certainly thinking about that as well. What is it you're aiming towards and how will that be different from what you're doing already?
Brilliant, thank you. So really a personal thank you from myself, but also a massive thank you on behalf of the Reach Network for taking time out and recording this and sharing your advice, your tips, and being so honest and candid about your own journey and what has worked for you and what you would have done differently. So thank you very much.
Thank you. You're very welcome.